So we were talking a moment ago about the Benton and Bowlsley years that you were there, heading up media and programming. One person that you mentioned that you worked with, Grant Tinker, was hired in 1958 at Benton and Bowlsley.
Right.
Did you work with him at that time?
Grant was there just prior to my taking over the department. And when I took over the department, Grant reported to me in the programming area.
And so he was learning a lot of what
Well,
you
he
had
knew
to
more.
offer.
He probably knew more than I did, but I was learning in the programming area. I had come from media, and I was learning in the program area, and Grant had been in the programming area. So he knew probably more than I did, and I was catching up pretty fast.
Anyone else that you worked with there?
Oh,
particular that
yes.
you mentioned?
Larry White, who became head of programming at NBC. Phil Capice, who was head of long-form programming at CBS. Erwin Siegelstein. We had the best programming department of anybody in the industry. Erwin Siegelstein, who became head of programming at CBS. Lee Curlin, who became head of programming also at CBS. Larry White, Lee, all these people, and I've left some out, were the best and all went on to have really great careers.
One of the shows that you've mentioned, and obviously was a incredibly important show, was the Dick Van Dyke Show. Can you tell us a little bit about how that show was brought to Benton and Bowlsley, and by whom?
I'll tell you. Carl Reiner did a pilot, which he started, and I forget the name of it, but he started, and it was basically the Dick Van Dyke Show. He then, he brought that pilot to us, and we all recognized that the idea was a great idea, but Carl was not right for it. So we talked to Carl, and Carl recognized that he wasn't the star for it, but he did write it. And we talked about doing it and finding somebody else to play the lead. We talked about a lot of people, and we finally came down to Dick Van Dyke. They flew into New York, met me. We watched Dick Van Dyke and Bye Bye Birdie, and we then met with him after the theater, and that was it. We hired Dick Van Dyke. We didn't know what the show. Carl's thing was called My Other Life. That was what it was, and we didn't want that title. And we sat around trying to think of a title, and we said, well, let's call it the Dick Van Dyke Show. Nobody knew Dick Van Dyke anyway, and at that time, and that's what we called it.
And was the pitch that Carl Reiner had brought to you essentially the same story that
It was basically the
same
same idea about a writer working just as the Van Dyke was. And the characters were basically the same. It was basically the same show with some alterations, but basically the same idea.
And who else was involved other than Carl Reiner?
Sheldon, well, at that time, Sheldon Leonard was also involved. And then later on, at the insistence of the Morris office, Danny Thomas came aboard.
As producers,
well,
writer,
Sheldon,
director?
Carl was the creator, and he would direct some. Sheldon would direct many of them. They were both producers on it, but it was Carl's basic idea, and it was Carl who pushed it and brought Sheldon in it, and together they formed a brilliant team.
And Danny, you said, was sort of
Danny was,
by...
I can tell that story. The Morris office, Sheldon and Danny were partners in everything they did. The Danny Thomas Show and the Andy Griffith Show and Gomer Pyle, they were all, Sheldon and Danny were partners. And this was the first time that Danny was not involved, and I got a call from the Morris office. And Procter & Gamble was putting up the money for the pilot, which at that time, if I remember correctly, was either $40,000 or $60,000 for a pilot. And I got a call from Abe Lasvogel saying, Danny is very hurt that he's not
Abe
involved.
At the Morris office.
Calling me, and Abe represented everybody. He represented Danny, Sheldon, and Carl. But he called me and he said that they were very Danny was upset. And I said, Abe, why are you calling me? I said, I have nothing to do with it. You want Danny to be involved? Get him involved. And Abe said, well, you guys are paying the $40,000. I said, that's right. And he said, well, Danny will put that money up, the 40 or 60, I'm not sure which it was. And I said, that's great. I said, as long as we have the first hold on the show, I don't care. So I called Procter & Gamble and I said, you don't have to put up the money and we have the first hold on the show. And that was how that got involved.
Can you talk about what the pitch was like of the show to Procter & Gamble? Did Carl
We
come in
showed
and-
him, I've got to remember this now. We showed them the one that Carl did.
And he had actually shot
a pilot.
a full half hour or a presentation?
Not of the Van Dyke show.
Of his own.
The one that he did,
Right.
My Other Life, which had been shot. And we showed him that, and from this point on, my memory is not too great. I'm pretty sure that Sheldon and Carl met, I think I do remember. The Procter & Gamble people, who also had an office out here, sent a fellow by the name of Bob Short, and George Giroux was out here. George Giroux was head of Procter & Gamble's West Coast office. Bob Short was head of programming at Procter & Gamble. And they came out and met with Carl and Sheldon. And I know I was there, and I think Grant was there.
Grant Tinker.
And they pushed it, and that's how we got the show.
Did they have any reservations about it when they heard it or when they
Oh,
saw
I
it?
think so. Sure, we did.
Any particular that you recall?
Well, number one, you felt much safer with a Danny Thomas or an Andy Griffith, who were known, than you did with a Dick Van Dyke, who nobody knew.
Outside of Broadway, he was.
Outside of Broadway, he had done pilots before, but none of them had ever sold. Sure, we had concerns, but we had concerns about every show until it went on the air.
Right. And the final outcome was that.
Well, the final outcome was that the show was put on at 8 o'clock or 8:30 on Tuesday nights.
On what
CBS.
network? CBS.
And didn't do well at all. In fact, Procter & Gamble was thinking of canceling it. They had complete sponsorship of it. And that was the time that Sheldon and I called CBS to try to get a different time period. And we got a different time period at 9:30 at Tuesday nights. So
What did you think that was going to do? Was there a better lead-in?
Yeah,
You didn't have to start
well,
the night
in those
off?
days, the lead-ins didn't mean a great deal because, there's no such thing as a bad time period. There really is. It's bad programming's in a time period. And I'll give you an example of that a little later. But so we got this time period and we did analysis on the difference of the two time periods, which we used to do on a regular basis. And we then, that was a time that Sheldon and I flew to Cincinnati from Los Angeles to try to save the show in this new time period.
Because it was Procter & Gamble who was concerned.
Procter
The
& Gamble
network
was ready to cancel
didn't
it.
care as long as the sponsor was going to be there.
Well, the network didn't give a damn. It was Procter & Gamble who saying, the show's not rating, and it's great, but we all love it, but the public doesn't. So we flew there. I'll never forget it. We flew all night long. We went to the hotel, took a shower. Sheldon Leonard took a shower and went over to the Procter & Gamble meeting and had a meeting with Halverstadt, who was head of advertising, and Paul Huth, who was head of programming and media. Both of them very good friends of mine because I had worked with them for years and years. And Sheldon was telling them about where he saw the show going and things of that kind. Nothing drastic. And then I made a pitch for the new time period and for the show. And Halverstadt, who's head of advertising, says that Ben and Bowl stand behind this. And I said, yes, we recommend it, we stand beside. Procter & Gamble said, okay, I want to cut I'm not sure about the 9:30 time period. I'm going to sell half of this show. And a lot of people don't remember that Old Gold, we sold half of the show to Old Gold. And the Dick Van Dyke Show at 9:30 on Tuesday nights was then sponsored by Procter & Gamble and Old Gold.
So you had made that recommendation, or they had said, we want to kind of mitigate our risk? And
Yes, we want to mitigate the risk.
We'll take half of the
That's-
program. You
they
find
said-
another sponsorship.
Yeah, he asked me, he said, how do you feel about a half a show for your brands and for everything else? And I said, I'd rather have half a show than lose the whole thing. I believe in this show.
Was that unusual at the time? Or did you
That
usually
was-
see a sponsor
It
sponsor
used
the whole
to,
half
it
hour?
was starting to happen more and more because television was becoming more expensive. And so it was starting to happen, let's cut our risk, we'll do half.
In 1965 was when you left Benton and Bowles?
I left Benton and Bowles in 1965.
And why did you decide
Well,
to do that?
because the quiz, you see, we had complete control. The advertising agencies had control of the television. We really did. The networks, we used the network, sure, they had to approve what was on the air, but the advertisers had made their inroads as far as the time periods were concerned. And then the quiz scandals came along just around that period of time. And the government finally said to the networks, you are now responsible for everything that goes on the air. You are responsible. And that gave the networks a reason to get total control of programming. And I could see that coming. And I had been offered a lot of jobs out here. I was offered head of programming at 20th Century Fox, at Universal. I knew the Mirishes very well, and Harold Mirish particularly, and Harold Mirish and UA were together. UA and the Mirishes were one, and UA wanted to get in. UA wanted the Mirishes to be in television. And John Sin, who you know, recommended me. They said, if you can get Lee Rich to run your television operation, we'll back it.
So they were actively in the feature film
business. Had not been on television.
But they wanted to get into that.
Yeah, so we became 50-50 partners. The Mirishes and Harold Mirish and myself.
And that was where you went immediately
Mirish
after Benton
Rich
and Bowles.
Productions, yeah.
Right after
that
Benton
was
and Bowles.
what it was.
Let's just backtrack for just a moment. We skipped over, we talked about different things that happened in the 1950s. One of the big events in the industry was the blacklist, the Hollywood blacklist, which obviously had a lot to do with the feature film community.
right.
But did it affect television as well, and Benton and Bowles
Certainly,
in particular?
certainly, yep.
How so?
Well, it affected us basically in the daytime area because we were producing like 3 or 4 daytime serials. We were producing, if I remember, Edge of Night, Guiding Light. I'm not sure of the names, but we were producing 3 or 4, and the other Procter & Gamble agencies were producing, and they were all being produced out of New York. And we had a blacklist, we had a list, we knew that, and Procter & Gamble insisted that we have one. I never got deeply involved in it, but I was aware of it, and I knew that there were certain actors we couldn't hire.
Actors, because they were on the blacklist.
Because they were on the blacklist.
Writers as well, or did that?
No, basically, I wouldn't do that phone. Basically, nobody's picking up the phone. Excuse
you want
me.
us to stop
I'm
for a
sorry.
moment?
It's all right.
Okay.
I love picking up. Basically, actors.
Mm-hmm. So you pretty much knew that they couldn't use those people that were on the blacklist, and you just had to stick to that.
That's right.
You couldn't go over it.
And that was the same thing were true of other advertisers too.
Mm-hmm. Going into the Mirish Rich production days, you mentioned that how it came about with just that you were the person that the backers wanted
Right.
in that company to get into the television arena.
And I loved Harold Mirisch. I just thought he was wonderful.
And how did you know? You knew him before that time?
I
or-
met him. I had met Harold, and through the UA people, I think, and we were on an airplane together once. I remember this, and I was sitting on the end seat, and he evidently was sitting there. I didn't know him at that time, and he saw me reading the trades, and he said to me, when you finish that, I'm just coming back from Europe. He says, can I have those? I said, of course. Well, my name was on the trades. So,
Mailing label.
Yeah. So when I finished, I handed it to him. And he said to me, oh, you're Lee Rich. And that's how we first started to get together.
So when you teamed up to form this production company, did you have very specific goals going from the producing and agency business to being an independent?
All I had was ambition and drive. And we did very well. The first series I produced was The Rat Patrol, which beat Lucy in the first and second year, but then it got too expensive, and it stayed on the air for 3 years, still being played somewhere. I've never seen a dime from it, UA's bookkeeping. But I had that on the air, and then Gary Marshall and Jerry Belson did their first TV series for me called Hey Landlord, which was on NBC. We did 13 episodes and got canceled. Then I did 2 or 3 daytime animated shows. I forget, one was, of course, The Pink Panther. We got that on the air, and a couple of others. I forget, I'm still getting some money from them, but I don't remember their names. So we were very successful. It was very, and I had a contract that was backed by UA. And unfortunately, then Harold passed away, and the other Mirishes were not interested in television at all. And I didn't want to be there. Arthur Krim came to me and said, "Why don't you stay on? We'll put you in the movie business and other things." And I said, "No." I said, "The movie business is not of great interest to me. I want to stay in television." And we did several great pilots. One is one of the best pilots Gary Marshall and Belson did, which we didn't sell, but became a cult kind of project called Sheriff Who. And so I worked very closely with Gary Marshall. And I just read a book that Gary Marshall quotes me in quite extensively. I had never read the book before. And so I finally said, no, I didn't want to do that. And I was thinking maybe I'd go back to the advertising business. I love the advertising business. And Procter & Gamble agencies could not raid one another. In other words, if I worked for Benton & Bowles, Compton or Y&R couldn't come after me. But there was one agency that wanted me for years and years, and that was Leo Burnett, and in Chicago. And I thought, gee, maybe, and they came out here in force when the Mirishes died, and offered me, the moon, to come work. And I said to Pippa, who I was married to at that time, let's go to Chicago. And so we went to Chicago. We had a beautiful thing on Lakeshore Drive. And I was there for a year, and then I had done it. I was bored with it. And I loved them, and they were very good to me, and I was very good to them. Kellogg's, I formed a relationship with Kellogg's and others. But I didn't want to do that. I had had a taste of actual on-the-air production. So I came back and formed and said, I'm going into business for myself.
Let's back up for just a moment. You mentioned a couple of the series when you had the Mirisch Rich Company. One was the Rat Patrol.
Yeah.
How did that was a 1 hour drama.
No,
was it a half?
That was a half hour.
Half hour.
Half
Can you
hour.
describe how that
Yeah.
show came into being?
Now I got to think of names. What's his name? He died. I'll think of the name.
Okay.
I'm sorry. He came to me with this idea of the Rat Patrol, and which I thought was a great idea for a half hour.
Can you give me the quick?
Well,
what
the thing was 4 fellows in a Jeep in the desert, and I just thought that was great. Particularly, we get 1 star or 1 person in it, and have a villain and everything else.
And they were 4 guys in a Jeep who were
In the war,
sort of fighting
World
in
War
the war.
World War II. They were just anyway. I thought it was a great idea, and prior to my leaving Benton and Bowles, I've got to go back. Prior to my leaving Benton and Bowles, I went to the heads of all the networks. And there was, in 1964, each of the networks used to make a play for the Procter & Gamble or the General Foods programming. In other words, if our programming was basically on CBS, and NBC, when the contracts came to being, NBC would try to get those shows over to NBC. ABC would do the same thing. While I was on my honeymoon in Palm Springs, NBC, now I represented all the Procter & Gamble shows on CBS. I also represented some on NBC. While I was on my honeymoon in Palm Springs, Y&R and made a pitch and got ABC to make a pitch to General Foods, giving them massive discounts. All they would have to do is move the shows from where they were now on CBS over to NBC.
So massive discounts in terms of the advertising rate.
Oh
what
yeah,
they would
and
pay.
they would pay programming costs. They would do all kinds of things to get
This was
these.
Young and Rubicon you mentioned?
Yeah, because these shows were top 10 shows. And they had been on the air. There was Danny Thomas, Andy Griffith, all of these shows they wanted. And then ABC got into the act as well. And ABC and NBC were both trying to get the programming away from CBS. And I got a call from Irwin Siegelstein and Lee Curlin
They were
at Benton and Bowles, and they said, "You better come home. We've got problems." And I remember I left and I flew to New York, and it was snowing in New York. And we stayed up, and they filled me in as to what NBC had offered and what ABC had offered to General Foods. And I mean, it was unbelievable, the offers. The offers were time periods, the offers were programming, the offers were money. It was fabulous. And then there was going to be a meeting at General Foods in White Plains with these 2 agencies. I mean, with Y&R making a pitch for either NBC or ABC. So I came in and I called Jim Aubrey at that time, who was head of CBS, and I said, "Let me tell you what's going on. You're going to lose this programming unless you help me." I said, "You've got to give me something." And he gave me, what's the show on Friday nights about the prison camp? The comedy about the prison camp, the Germans, the Americans and the Germans. Hogan's Heroes. And he gave me that. He said, "This is your programming."
Who had been either producing?
No, it was a brand new show.
I see.
And it was a time period on Friday night at 8 o'clock.
That they had developed, the network had
The
developed?
network had
I see.
developed that. See, they were getting into the programming business. And so he gave me that. And then he gave me some discounts. So I put together a presentation. And we went up to White Plains, and I made the presentation. Each of us did it separately. And all I said to them is, here's what I've got to offer you. I've got another show for you. And I showed them Hogan's Heroes, which they liked. They said, we'll buy half. And I sold the other half to Philip Morris. So that, and they had discounts, but they said, my God, the NBC offer and the ABC offers are so tremendous. And I said one thing to them. I said, look, you got 6 shows in the top 10. If they fall out of the top 10, that's your responsibility. You're going to have to take the blame for that. And that's all I had to say to them. And we kept the business. Well, NBC was so angry, ABC particularly, Tom Moore particularly. So prior to my leaving Benton and Bowles, and I was now going into the production business, and I had to do business with them, I went to Jim Aubrey, and I went to Tom Moore, and I went to Walter Scott and said, look, I was just doing my job, and you may be upset and everything else. Well, everybody was fine except Tom Moore. Tom Moore said, you're never going to do business with this network. You're never going to do business with this network. Anyway, the pilot I did, Rat Patrol, was for ABC. Ed Sherrick was the one who got it. We showed this pilot, and the pilot was tremendous. Harold Mirisch got his cutters on it, and he got his music people on it, and we really had a tremendous pilot. And we showed it at the Goldwyn Studios on Santa Monica in that big room, and I put the sound up as loud as I possibly could, and they flipped out over it. But Tom Moore said, I told him, he was Southern, I told him he would never get a show on this air, and I don't care. And I must say, Ed Sherrick piped up and said, we need hit shows. If this was from Hitler, I would take it. And that's how the show got on the air. Anyway, that was an aside.
Now, just to back up for a second, how did Pippa feel about having to cut your honeymoon short?
Well, she, that was part of the business.
Who was the casting in Rat Patrol? There were 4 leads, is that right?
4 leads. Mm-hmm. I don't remember their names at all.
Were you involved in the casting process?
Oh,
on
sure,
that?
certainly.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of your daily duties on that show, were you overseeing?
I learned. I didn't know a damn thing.
So there was sort of somebody who was on a line producer that was...
Tom Grice was the fellow who came in and created the show, Gries. And Tom passed away, but Tom was the one. And we shot the pilot in Arizona, where we needed the Arizona or New Mexico, where we needed the sand dunes, because that's where it was going to be. And I went down there, and I didn't know very much. I just learned. I was just watching and observing, and I was involved in the casting, but I really knew very little, I must say. And I learned a lot and made a lot of mistakes.
We're going to pick up in just a moment. We're going to change tapes and then pick up. I've got some follow-up questions.